I'm on I'm on the 350 steering committee, and I'm co-chair of New Mexico Interfaith Power and Light, and a core member of Valencia Water Watchers, which is fighting fracking in Valencia County. And in June of this year, I had an opportunity to go with IPL on a Permian immersion retreat. And the impact of seeing the devastation in the Permian and the impact of rampant oil and gas production on the people and the communities in the Permian really inspired me to try and get the word out to a broader audience about the impacts of the Permian being a sacrifice zone, and to raise awareness about the Permian and what we can do. So when I was on the retreat, I met Kayley. Kayley Shoup is a young woman who was born and raised in Carlsbad. After graduating from Interlochen Arts Academy, she pursued a career as a performer. In 2018, she moved back and quickly realized her community that she called home had been altered tremendously by the Permian oil boom. Within a year, she watched an abnormal number of young people dealing with devastating diagnoses. This is when her passion for environmental activism was truly awakened, and she began working with Citizens Caring for the Future, which at the time in 2020 was the only climate advocacy group in the region. And Kayley feels incredibly grateful to know and work with other concerned citizens, grassroots advocates, and environmental stewards in the Permian. So I'll turn it over to Kayley.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for having me tonight, and thank you for that introduction, Anne. I really appreciate it. So as Anne mentioned, I'm a community organizer with Citizens Caring for the Future. I believe that we still are maybe the only grassroots environmental advocacy group of our kind in the entirety of the Permian Basin, including Southeast New Mexico and West Texas. That is starting to change. I know Earthworks is working to get a group off of the ground in West Texas. And then also we recently had a community member from West Texas reach out to us saying, we've heard of your work. We want to start a similar group. Can we talk to you about that? So that's very exciting progress that has been a long time coming. And because of the politics of the region, it can be really hard to get people engaged. So that is a really exciting update, and we are hoping to have a few more people in this sea of oil with us. It is a little interesting that we are the only advocacy group, and a little bit scary because the Permian Basin is the most productive oil basin in the country and one of the most productive basins in the world. So we really need more advocacy coming out of the area. Again, that can be easier said than done. But for those who are not familiar with Citizens Caring for the Future, I just wanted to give you a quick little story about how we got started. So in the spring of 2019, Interfaith Power and Light New Mexico El Paso region organized a faith immersion retreat similar to the one that Anne was on this summer in the Permian Basin. And faith leaders from Albuquerque met people from Hobbs and Carlsbad and got to hear their stories and concerns. And they also got to tour several locations in the Permian oil field with Earthworks. So they had some panel sessions during this immersion retreat. And during one of the panel sessions, Carlsbad faith leaders and people of faith got to hear the concerns of their neighbors really for the first time. As I mentioned, the politics of this area, it's a very Republican area, very pro oil and gas. And so you don't often hear people speaking of their concerns around the oil and gas industry, but they were in this forum where they were able to hear that other people were concerned about the same things as them, ways our communities had been impacted and health impacts, things like that. And at that point, they felt compelled to do something to address the health, social, and environmental concerns that had really increased with the oil boom. And some faith leaders and people of faith came forward and offered to serve as a steering committee, and then Interfaith Power and Light, along with Earthworks, worked with them, and that's how Citizens Caring for the Future was born. And some of the early work of the group was including learning how to give comments at New Mexico methane hearings. The rules were in the works at that time. And I think really the first advocacy thing they did was they spoke at a methane hearing meeting in 2019. And this was an in-person event in Carlsbad. And I came on as a community organizer in 2021. So to this day, I have not had to do an in-person event in Carlsbad yet. And I kind of dread the day that I have to do that because it's kind of a terrifying experience. And man, this little group of people got together and they stood up and in a room full of people that were very pro-industry and also their community members. And they said, you know, we're concerned about this. So just incredibly brave, especially at that time. We train people how to talk with media and their neighbors. And early on, one of the large concerns was the lack of air monitoring in the region. We still have that lack of air monitoring. There's only 3 air monitors in the entirety of the Permian Basin. There's one in Eddy County, one in Lee County, and then the National Parks operates one at the Carlsbad Caverns. And this is only monitoring things like ozone and particulate matter and things that are required to be monitored under the Clean Air Act. So you're not really getting a clear picture of everything we are being exposed to. And that was a really big concern of our group. And I'm happy to announce that we've now been working with the New Mexico Environment Department. They have entered a grant competition on our behalf to acquire funding to get an air monitor that will be added to the space that we have the ozone monitor in Eddy County. And this new air monitor will monitor the BTEC suite of pollutants, so benzene, toluene, ethylbenzene, and xylene. And these are also ozone precursors like methane, and are emitted along with methane, but really have a big health impact. Benzene is a known carcinogen, I'm sure as a bunch of you know. And there's really a lack of education in this region about the health impacts that come with living near oil and gas. And so we're really hoping that once folks get to see just how much they're being exposed to, because we hope to have this data on an online forum, that it'll kind of, you know, engage them and get them more activated in working towards cleaner air, less oil and gas production in our region. Some other things Citizens Caring for the Future does and did in the past, we played an integral role in advocating for environmental safeguards on the state and national level, and our leading voice for a transition to a green economy. And also we've had some of our leaders speak at COP25. So we've been involved in a lot of different things through the years. But a little bit about how I got involved. So as Anne mentioned, I was born and raised in Carlsbad. I graduated high school in 2010, and then I moved back home in 2018. And this was as the oil and gas boom was, you know, really, I would say at its peak. We actually are producing more right now, but at the time, you could really feel the impacts in the community a lot more. I'm not exactly sure why that is. We don't seem to have the same amount of workers right now. I think it's maybe because infrastructure is already in place and things like that. But so it was really just what I would consider the peak if you're really here in the community and feeling the impacts. And so when I moved back, I was not someone that was really, you know, tuned into politics. I wasn't really worrying about climate change that much. I came to all of this very organically. And when I did come back, you know, there was a lot of systemic issues that you could kind of see right off the bat and just changes to day-to-day life. So Carlsbad is a small town. We never dealt with things like traffic. All of a sudden, it would take 30 minutes to get across town because you just have semis backed up, you know, for miles and miles. There was daily car crashes on the highways, fatal car crashes, and a lot of these wouldn't be reported on in the region or even locally because it's a lot of transient workers, things like that. We had an influx of about 20,000 people to Carlsbad at that time. Again, it's a small town. We do not have the infrastructure to deal with that many people. And so the cost of living skyrocketed. There was a lot of new students at the schools. They needed to hire more teachers. They couldn't do that because those teachers could not afford the cost of living here. So just a lot of systemic issues that were very apparent in day-to-day life. But then within about a year of being back, within that first year, I started to hear from a lot of my acquaintances that a lot of people were being diagnosed with rare and aggressive cancers. And, you know, these are young and relatively young people. And then my own mother at the age of 50 was diagnosed with ovarian cancer without any family history. That's a fairly rare cancer, and that's a pretty young age to be diagnosed with it. A friend of mine in his 20s diagnosed with a form of cancer that should be very treatable. He was diagnosed at an early stage, and of course, rare and aggressive form, and metastasized. He is doing well now, but, you know, almost lost his life. So at that point, I started to think there must be environmental concerns at play, because this is just really an abnormal amount of people that I'm encountering with these issues. And this was late 2019, and I went looking for ways to kind of get engaged. And now I am very engaged, but at the time I didn't really know where to turn. And there's not a ton of resources here in Southeast New Mexico. There's not a lot of local people that you can ask, hey, do you know about these things? So I actually saw on Facebook an ad that Earthworks had put up. And at the time, the Produced Water Act had just passed in the prior legislative session. And the New Mexico Environment Department was having the community meetings on that. And there was one in Carlsbad. So I went to that meeting. And it was mainly just representatives from our region. So these are very pro-gas, pro-oil and gas representatives. And then also people from the industry. But there was also a family there, a family of 4 with 2 young kids. It was a school night. And they brought them, and they stood up and they asked the New Mexico Environment Department. They said, you know, we live out in the middle of all of the action, essentially. And we have these trucks that keep coming to our house and dumping produced water on our land. And we call, you know, the cops, but they can't do anything. They say they have no jurisdiction. What can you all do to help us? And at the time, New Mexico Environment Department really didn't have much that they could do either. And they said, you know, basically, there's not really anything we can do, was the nitty gritty of it. But then that got into a conversation at that meeting about kind of the state of regulation and enforcement in New Mexico. And, you know, that's when I learned that we didn't have any air inspectors living in the region, things like that. And growing up in Carlsbad, I grew up around WIP. And as you all know, WIP is, you know, pretty heavily regulated. And so in my mind, everything was what regulated like WIP is. And that was the day that my bubble was kind of burst. And I learned that that's actually not the case. So I left that meeting very scared, terrified. And then the pandemic happened, life changed for a while. I didn't think about it for a long time. And then in November of 2020, I had been involved with some election things and had encountered one of the Citizens Caring for the Future leaders. And right after the election, he got in touch with me and he said, hey, I'm going out into the field with this person from Earthworks. They look at oil and gas pollution through this FLIR video camera. I was wondering if you would be interested in going out. And I said, oh yeah, I would love that. So I met these people that I had really never met in person before on the side of the highway to go out into the oil field and look at sites. And when I got there, they said, we're going to go first to Penny and Dee's house. And I don't know, some of you are maybe familiar with Penny and Dee. And I had actually just read their story about 2 days before and thought to myself, I have to get in touch with these people. You know, I can't believe they're finding out about this. They're doing this work because it's much easier said than done to even, as I said, get engaged in this region. But for those of you that aren't familiar with Penny and Dee, they had a produced water pipeline in January 2020. It was across the street from their house. It burst and it showered their house with radioactive produced water, essentially. And they had to put all of their animals to sleep that were exposed to it. And they eventually ended up settling with the company and are now out of Carlsbad. But I got to go to their home that day and meet them. Then we all went out into the field and I learned about the work that Citizens Caring for the Future was doing and organized a small community meeting. And then from there, they were looking for a community organizer and got involved after that. So that's just a little bit about how I got involved with everything. So as I mentioned a little bit about how the Permian is today, I did say that production is actually at the highest that it's ever been. 2021 saw the most barrels of crude oil reported in the history of the region, and my guess is that 2022 may even top that. It's interesting, we are having production in new places. I would assume that this is probably because of the conflict in Ukraine and the added demand for liquefied natural gas. So the Permian Basin is primarily an oil basin, but we do have regions that are gas basins. And you can see a lot more production going on in those areas. And that's kind of not where the production over the past few years has happened. It's a little bit in a different region. And so it looks a little bit different. But production is up. I was actually on a faith immersion retreat last week. I was helping to lead one, and we were out in the field, and there is more rigs than really I have ever seen driving around the area. When I started this time last year going out into the field, you wouldn't see many rigs, and that has definitely changed. A lot of flaring going on, even though, you know, it is banned in New Mexico, but, you know, you're seeing a lot of flaring, things like that. And with the passage of the Inflation Reduction Act, you know, we're likely to see a lot more production for years to come. And the BLM has actually recently announced a new lease cell. So things are just really willing and dealing down here, and looks to be that it'll be that way for a while. So in Eddy County, we have seen a 40% increase of folks living near oil and gas wells in the past 5 years. And as we all know, this comes with a lot of health impacts such as cancer, asthma, reproductive issues, endocrine issues. And you can really see evidence of this when we just kind of talk to people in the community. Once you know what the health impacts are, and then you start talking to people, and they, you know, they'll tell you about what's going on with them. And I always make a point to ask, you know, where do you live? And they'll mention it, and I you know, keep a running tally of where things are. And a lot of the time, these folks live near oil and gas infrastructure. But I will say that we do have people becoming more aware of these health impacts in Southeast New Mexico. And, you know, we're really starting to make some inroads and make a dent in awareness. I recently was able to speak at an event for Somos en Pueblo Nido, and there was folks from Lee County there, and they walked up to me afterward and said, you know, we sit on the Lee County Health Council, and we would love for you to do a presentation on this in the future. So this is something that Southeast New Mexico, you know, people are starting to become more aware and more engaged in this issue. But we do need stronger rules and regulations to protect the air and water quality in this region, and then also the landscape of the Permian Basin. And there's lots of ways that you folks can kind of get involved in doing that. The EPA will be coming out with new methane rules very, very soon. And we will need public comment once those do come out. So we do ideally want rules that ban routine venting and flaring on a federal level. This is really important for the Permian Basin, as we are Texas and New Mexico, and obviously emissions don't know borders. And then, you know, we want inspections on smaller leak-prone wells and things like that. So that's one way that people can really stay engaged. And then Tannis is also going to touch on ways that we can stay engaged in the upcoming legislative session on a state level. But I do also want to underline for folks that regulation does not equal results. And that's very pertinent when you drive through the Permian Basin. As I mentioned, you know, we have a ban on routine venting and flaring in the state of New Mexico. But if you drive through the Permian, I mean, it is vast, and there are thousands upon thousands of wells. And you kind of realize, oh, it's kind of, you know, it would take a small army to really regulate this. So that's why it's really important that we all advocate for increased funding for regulatory positions in the New Mexico Environment Department, and then also the Oil Conservation Division. They're really in need of a lot more resources. And it also underlines the importance of really the way we cut into this more than anything is a managed decline. That's how we can really make sure that these emissions are cut. And then also with you folks, I know a lot of you are probably in northern New Mexico. I just want to underline, do not count Southeast New Mexico out of your conversations. As I mentioned, we're getting people more and more engaged. And I've really seen, you know, just an increase in folks willing to speak out about this and talk about these issues. And I'm hoping that in the near future, we can consolidate that into, you know, some kind of political power. So a lot of the resources available to us here in Southeast New Mexico come from oil and gas. So, you know, a lot of our community initiatives are funded by oil and gas. So, you know, if you know of organizations that want to come into communities and fund different initiatives, things like that, please be in touch with me, whether that's STEM labs or just really anything like that. We're really working to have more of a footprint in the community from an environmental organization side of things. We want folks to be aware that it's not just folks coming in and saying, oh, we need stronger rules that do this and this and this. A lot of people from the region see that as that threatens my job. But we really want to make sure that folks know that folks also come in, or environmental organizations will also come in and fund things in their community and be an active part of it. And we're starting to get there, and we're starting to see, as I said, the fruits of our labor, and that is really exciting. So with that, that is a little bit about what it's like on the ground in the Permian. And I think, was there some questions in the chat, Tom, that we want to address?
Yeah, Kayley, why don't you start with, someone asked if you'd please speak to what it smells and looks like there.
Oh, yes. Okay. It smells like, if you've ever been in an oil and gas region, I mean, it's kind of hard to explain what that smell is. And does anyone else kind of want to take a shot at it that smells it a lot? Maybe like a dairy a little bit. It's kind of that similar type of scent when you're near oil and gas infrastructure. I will say in Carlsbad, if you're really just in like the city major, then you're not smelling too much. It's not like Artesia where it's the whole area can be inundated. Hobbs is also that way. But the landscape, when you drive any direction out of Carlsbad or really in southeast New Mexico, and you are in a wasteland. We have older oil fields, and those are cities of pump jacks. That's really jarring when you go and see that. The newer production is different. You drive around, there's not as many pump jacks, but the ground is just covered in pipelines. And there's infrastructure, again, as far as the eye can see. So it does look like a wasteland. And if you were ever interested in coming this way, I'm happy to, tour folks around and kind of give you an idea of what it's like. There's also a lot of smog in the region. We were driving out in the field the other day, and there was just a brown cloud. There was like, you could look out to the east and there was just this little line of brown. And so that's something that you can see, the air pollution, it continues. What's interesting is when you look towards the region that's the oil basin and the area that has been more active over the past few years, the air is a little bit clearer there. There really is a difference between older infrastructure and newer infrastructure. It does burn a lot cleaner, and you can actually tell because our basins are in an opposite direction. So you look to the north here, a lot more smog in terms of the older production, and actually towards the gas basin, the newer production, the air is a little bit more clear, but that's just a little bit of a picture of what it looks like. I'm sure. Anne, do you have any more descriptors that you would say?
Well, it just smells really badly. And what was interesting is I was only there for a day and a half, and we're mostly driving and not necessarily walking out in the fields. And so quickly, not just myself, but the people that were on this retreat developed headaches.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think I'm desensitized to that in a lot of ways. But yeah, it's prominent. If you drive on any highway in this region, you're smelling a lot and really taking in a lot of pollution.
We have maybe take one more question. Someone asked, any signs of capping of abandoned wells?
Not any that I've seen. I'm sure that activity is probably going on. Maybe I would have to go out into Loco Hills, where I've been recently, is more kind of in the new region. But I haven't heard much about capping, and I haven't, seen much engagement on that level yet, but hopefully we will have, some of that going on in, again, Loco Hills region, kind of these older regions that are a huge source of pollution and really need to be taken care of. Go ahead, Don.
I just, thanks so much, Kayley. I just wanted to say to the question about we want to say plugging, not capping. It's just a technical issue. We kind of want to promote the correct language. So we need to plug those zones down below the ground. We need to remediate the contamination that's there, and then we need to restore. So it makes it really long: plug, remediate, and restore. But on Kayley's point about the understaffing of the agencies and trying to meet even their own regulations, I just want to shout out to the OCD that I work with on a very regular basis. They have led a 220 well, and again, this gets technical, but orphan, abandoned, and idle well contract to plug, remediate, and restore in southern New Mexico, in the Permian, and that's just the start of it. So this administration and through the Secretary of Energy and on to the OCD is working very hard on this. We're opening it up. We're pushing hard from the north. We do recognize you, of course. We are the methane hotspot, the Four Corners methane hotspot. We're still as bad. It's just that you're worse. So of course we recognize you. And Kayley, it's so inspiring to have you speaking here tonight. Thanks.
Thank you.
Why don't we take two more questions and then go to Tannis's presentation, and then we'll open up again for questions. You want to unmute yourself, Jim?
Thank you, Ann. Just Kayley, your story is inspiring. Thank you very much for being with us tonight. Of course, Carlsbad and the, as you mentioned, and the Permian sits across the New Mexico-Texas border. And I know you're mostly working in New Mexico. What can you tell us about what's going on the Texas side of the Permian?
Yeah, so I can't speak a ton to the Texas side of the Permian. I will say in Texas, a lot of what's going on in New Mexico is on federal or state lands. So we are public lands. So, you know, policy and things like that has a bigger impact on us. West Texas, a lot of it is private land, and so they're not nearly as impacted by policy, as I said. But when you do drive from Southeast New Mexico to West Texas, you can see a difference in the amount of flaring and also the amount of air pollution. There really is a difference. Flares are a lot bigger in Texas. The saying goes, everything's bigger in Texas. That's true in the oil field. But you can also see more air pollution as well. But again, I can't speak a ton to what's going on in Texas. I'm not overly engaged in that space, but they are not nearly as affected by regulation as we are. That's why federal EPA methane rules would be very great, as it's not going to be easy to turn down production there whatsoever. There's really no levers that the federal government can pull to stop leasing there.
All right, thank you very much.
Steph, you want to go ahead?
Yeah, Kayley, at the recent oil and gas energy summit that was held in Santa Fe with all the oil companies, I was reading in a paper that they were saying that all the pollution is coming from Mexico. So I think that's their way of short circuiting any federal laws. So have you heard that before? And they said that was based on science. So I was wondering where that came from.
Fascinating. I have actually not heard that one before, shockingly enough. But I will say that the Permian, the EPA is looking at designating us a non-attainment zone.
That's what they were referring to.
Okay, yes. So I have not heard them blame it on Mexico yet, but I would say it's very obviously not from there. And I will keep an eye out for that talking point, because that's interesting. There's quite a bit of distance between the border and the Permian Basin, so I would say that's something to note.
Must be the immigrants carrying it in with them.
There you go. The immigrants that are being driven from their home by climate catastrophe. They're bringing it. Yeah.
Well, Kayley, thank you. So let's go ahead and have Tannis talk about the New Mexico oil and Gas Justice and Reform Act, and then we'll have you take more questions at the end. And I know there's some more in the chat. And so our next presenter is Tannis Fox, who I reconnected with around our Valencia County fracking fight, and I'm so glad to have her on our side. Tannis joined the Western Environmental Law Center in 2020, where she focuses on moving New Mexico away from its over-reliance on oil and gas production and over to clean sources of energy. Tannis did environmental protection work for the state of New Mexico for almost 20 years, first with the New Mexico AG's office, and then as Deputy General Counsel for the New Mexico Environment Department. She was the 2016 recipient of the Carl Sauder Water Protection Award, awarded from the New Mexico Environmental Law Center for her work on trying to prevent groundwater contamination from copper mines. Prior to joining the Environmental Law Center for her work there, prior to joining, WELC, the Western Environmental Law Center, Tannis served as the U.S. Senator Tom Udall's speechwriter for 4 years. Tannis graduated from Williams College with a major in economics, graduated magna cum laude from the Indiana University Maurer School of Law, and clerk for the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Ninth Circuit. So Tannis has done incredible work for water protection and to mitigate the impacts of oil and gas production in our state. So we'd like to turn it over to Tannis.
Hey, thank you so much, Anne, for that. And thank you for everybody being here. There's a lot of people here tonight not watching Monday Night Football, so I appreciate you being here instead of there. Let's see, a couple of things preliminary to my talk, which is about the modernization of the New Mexico Oil and Gas Act. And that is first, Steffi, to your question on pollution coming from New Mexico. Whether pollution is coming from Mexico, whether pollution is coming from Mexico or not, there are the air monitors that Kayley spoke about in the Permian Basin. And those air monitors, which are close to the sources, do show a tremendous amount of air pollution, in the form of ozone precursors and ozone pollution, which is why the New Mexico Environment Department proposed rules to reduce ozone precursors, to reduce ozone formation just this last year. So there is verifiable air pollution coming from oil and gas in the Permian Basin, no doubt about it. That's the first thing. Second thing, Jim wanted me to tell people about the opportunity for public comment at an upcoming rulemaking that's going to occur this Wednesday and this Thursday in Farmington to implement emission limits on carbon dioxide coming from coal-fired power plants in New Mexico. This particular rulemaking, which is in front of the New Mexico Environmental Improvement Board, will apply, as a practical matter, will only apply to San Juan Generating Station near Farmington, because that's the only existing coal-fired power plant over which the EIB has jurisdiction. And the Environment Department has put forth a rule to implement an emission standard that was actually passed by the legislature in the Energy Transition Act. And there are a few loopholes in their proposal that ourselves, along with a number of other groups, including Sierra Club and some frontline groups, are trying to close. And so I think Tom was going to link to the talking points.
I just did, Tannis.
Great. And then,
In the chat.
and the link to appear virtually at that hearing will be both in person and virtual on Wednesday and Thursday. That link is in the talking points. The times for public comment during that hearing are Wednesday at 1 and 5, and Thursday at 9 in the morning and 1, if people are so inclined. So those are my 2 announcements. That's my public service announcement for everybody. And then
Tannis, just one quick thing, those public comment times have been revised. It's both 1 o'clock on Wednesday and 1 o'clock on Thursday. They've eliminated the other times.
no, they haven't.
Okay,
They're at 1 o'clock on Wednesday and 5 o'clock on Wednesday. I mean, that's, yeah, for 1 o'clock and 5 o'clock on Wednesday, and 9 o'clock and 1 o'clock on Thursday. I'm pretty sure, I'm sort of positive about that, just because that's what's in the procedural order for the hearing, and I am, representing parties in that hearing. So where did that information about the time change come from?
Camilla.
Oh, she was clarifying, I know what email you're talking about. She was clarifying that the time for public comment is at 1 o'clock and not 12 o'clock, because there was some misinformation around that.
Okay.
9 and 1, 1 and 5, 9 and 1.
Okay, great.
Let's see. Also, let's see. Thank you again, everybody, for being here. I'm really honored to be here. I was honored to represent 350 New Mexico, both in the methane waste rule hearings in 2021 before the Oil Conservation Commission, and the ozone precursor rulemaking before the Environmental Improvement Board last fall. And we at Western Environmental Law Center, and me in particular, really we're honored that you have placed, your trust in us, to do that. So I wanted to acknowledge that. And then I also want to acknowledge that Dawn Schreiber was one of my star witnesses in both proceedings. Go Dawn. Okay. Let's see. So I'm going to talk about the modernization of the Oil and Gas Act now, and I am going to do that via a PowerPoint that I am going to share right now. There. Okay. Okay, so the part of the New Mexico Oil and Gas Act that we're proposing to reform dates back to 1935. So that's 65, 85 years ago. And at that point in time, development of the resource was the paramount and really singular public interest at stake. But the world has changed dramatically since 1935. We now know that greenhouse gas emissions from oil and gas contribute mightily to climate change. Some reports say up to 50%. In New Mexico, based on the governor's climate plan report, oil and gas is the largest contributor to greenhouse gases in New Mexico, coming in at over half of the greenhouse gases that are emitted in our state. We also know now that air pollutants from oil and gas create serious public health risks, some of which Kayley has already talked about. And I must say, Kayley, I was quite moved by your stories of young people in your community who you know, who are getting these terrible cancers, and that's part of what moved you, to do this work. And so this is real life stuff, and people who live closer to oil and gas wells are at greater risk. And these risks I've sort of outlined. I mean, they're exposed to a lot of hazardous pollutants, and they're at risk for a lot of really terrible, debilitating illnesses of sort of your vital systems as a result of living, working, playing close to oil and gas. And we also know now that communities of color Indigenous people, low-income persons, and vulnerable populations are disproportionately impacted. For the ozone precursor rule proceeding, EDF estimated that 35,000 New Mexicans live within 1,000 feet of the oil and gas wells are going to be regulated in that rule. And that's pretty close. 1,000 feet is pretty close. Over half of those were people of color, including over 5,800 Native Americans. More than 5,700 were living in poverty. Over 2,700 were children under the age of 5 who were so vulnerable. More than 4,500 were adults over 65 or older. So in New Mexico, we have this data that shows that these populations are more at risk. Now, as you can imagine, in 1935, these impacts, climate, public health, environmental justice concerns were just not at issue, but they are now. And the Oil and Gas Act has not kept pace with today's realities by any stretch. There's a public interest not only in development of the resource, but also in protecting the environment, protecting public health, and making sure that communities of color, EJ communities, frontline communities, don't bear the brunt of these harms. So at WELC, we're proposing to modernize the Oil and Gas Act to take account of today's realities and the full panoply of public interests that are at stake. What we have done is we've prepared a discussion draft to reform the act. I don't know, how many of you on tonight's call have seen that. If you want a copy, you can email me and ask for a copy. And we have been seeking very diligently input from frontline communities, state agencies, conservation, and other environmental organizations and industry on that draft. And what I'm going to present to you this evening is the draft that we have, but we are in the process of, after gathering all this input from all these various sources, of making some changes to it. But the basic contours and the fundamental purpose of what we're trying to do is going to stay the same. So first and foremost, what our proposal aims to do is to authorize the Oil Conservation Commission and the Oil Conservation Division, which are the administrative agencies that make rules and implement the act, to protect the environment, protect public health, and make sure that EJ communities are fairly treated and are involved in decisions that impact their lives and their well-being. Now that probably seems to everybody pretty darn basic, but the Oil and Gas Act as written right now doesn't provide that kind of authority. It is purely about development of the resource. And if you, for example, and Don might remember this, if you want to bring in evidence of climate change impacts to the methane waste rule, you really couldn't do it very easily because the Oil Conservation Commission isn't authorized to take account of climate change or environmental impacts of what they're doing. We also want to reform who is making the decisions. So we want to reform the authority and what they can consider, and we want to reform who is making the decisions. Right now, the Oil Conservation Commission, which is the major rulemaking body, has 3 members, one appointed by the Secretary of Energy, Minerals, Natural Resources Department, one from the State Land Office, and the OCD Director. So as a practical matter, the governor controls the OCC. So who's ever governor, Republican, Democrat, whatever, controls the OCC because they have two of the 3 votes. They have the eminent secretary vote, and then they have the OCD director vote. So we want to and there's no consideration for environment, public health, no representation, EJ communities, no representation there. So we want to expand the OCC to 7 members, which would retain the state land office designee, retain the MNERD secretary designee, but expand the commission to include people with expertise in the environment, public health, and in or from EJ communities to be appointed through the legislature, which would mean, we think, that appointment would come from a broader base of representation than simply, who's in power as governor. And then 2 governor appointees, 1 a petroleum engineer who does not have any current ties to oil and gas as an employee or contractor, and a person of a different political affiliation from the governor to, balance that when needed. So those are the 2 big ideas, is to expand their authority, expand who makes those decisions. And we think that the decision-making would change dramatically as a result. There are some other major concerns that we have in the legislation. Those are really 2, one having to do with financial assurance that oil and gas companies put up for their wells, and one having to do with establishing setbacks to protect frontline communities. So the first, there's been, probably a lot of people on this call are familiar with some of the reports and all of that have come out recently, especially from the state land office, about the inadequacy of bonding to bond for if oil and gas wells are abandoned in the state, and the taxpayers, you and me, have to clean up. So OCD estimates that to plug and abandon one well is about $55,000, really upwards. The state land office estimate is even higher. And the state land office has estimated that the cost to clean up the current wells that are in place in New Mexico, which number in the tens of thousands, is exceeded by the amount of bonding that's in place by over $8 billion. And so that's just astounding. One problem with the Oil and Gas Act is that it sets a ceiling of $250,000 for what's called a blanket bond. And a company can bond, 10, 100, literally 1,000 wells through a blanket bond. And the Oil and Gas Act sets a ceiling of $250,000 for bonding for those, let's say 1,000 wells. We'll do the math. If, one well costs $50,000 and you've got a bond for $250,000 for $1,000, you're in kind of a deficit situation. So we propose to eliminate that ceiling and set the amount by rule based on the evidence of what a secure bond should be. People also probably appreciate that in New Mexico, there's just a lot of wells that are at risk, wells that are inactive for whatever reason. They're not highly productive, but yet operators aren't, plugging and abandoning them. Wells that are in what's called approved temporary abandoned status, and that's an approved status on the one hand, but they can languish there for many years. So there's literally thousands of at-risk wells in New Mexico that are undercapitalized for bonding purposes. And what we're proposing, our second proposal with respect to bonding, is for those at-risk wells to require what's called one well financial assurance. You can't just blanket bond them and say, hey, we've got a company that can take care of this liability. These are at-risk wells, and because they're at risk, we need to look at those wells and what it would cost to plug, abandon, remediate, because there's more likelihood that those wells will end up abandoned and become the responsibility of the taxpayer. So that's our financial assurance proposal. And then second, right now, in large measure, because OCC, OCD do not have authority to protect public health, they probably don't have authority to establish setbacks between where an oil and gas well is located and where a home, school, business is located. There's no state setback. Some local governments have setbacks, some do not. And so we propose to give OCC, OCD the authority to establish setbacks that are located near homes, schools, and businesses, because we know that those people who inhabit those places are more at risk. So overall, we want to bring the Oil and Gas Act into the 21st century to meet the 21st century challenges that we know we face here in New Mexico, and that reflect all the public interests at stake, not just development of the resource. So that's our proposal, and be glad to answer any questions about that.
Thank you, Tannis.
I don't know if you want me to call on people, but Margaret Bell has a question.
Go right ahead. You want to read the question, Tannis, and just proceed?
So,
Is it in the chat?
Oh, I
Chat?
see.
okay, so
She's got
thank
her
you.
hand raised. Go ahead, Margaret.
My question is on the setbacks. Any chance of that being implemented? I realize this is just in a proposal stage, but being implemented retroactively so that if you have a well that's close to a playground or a school, if this new act were to go into effect, could it be made to require that the oil and gas company shut that well down and plug it and remediate and restore?
That is not anything on the table, probably not a political possibility, not something that states and local governments are doing. There may be things that you can do to better protect people from the current situation, and our proposal would authorize consideration of that because it would give OCC and OCD the authority to protect public health. So this specific provision in the draft that we have right now applies to new wells. And Kayley, I don't know if you want to weigh in, because Kayley, we've worked very closely with Kayley on this issue. She's a strong and effective advocate on this issue.
Yeah, Western Environmental Law Center has done a lot of talking to frontline communities about this, because this is, the part that we are most concerned about. So it's in the works where we do want it to be an authority. Ideally, we would have minimum setbacks for the state, but we do realize, as Tannis said, that politically, some of these things are hard to get across the finish line. But yeah, there's lots of talks about the setback provision, but frontline communities have really been in the room and weighing in heavily. So we really appreciate that.
We appreciate you.
Thanks. Hey, Tannis, I'd like to read a question from the chat, and then we can go to the folks with their hands raised. This is from Paul Stokes. Do the stats on greenhouse gas emissions include emissions from the combustion of oil and gas, or is it only emissions from the production of oil and gas?
From the governor's report,
Yes.
I would have to look at that report. I am not sure they're downstream emissions, but I would have to relook at that report. That's an excellent question.
Okay.
Because if it doesn't include downstream emissions, then the emissions are much greater.
I think it does not include emissions from combustion. So,
Yeah.
but,
Hey,
yeah.
why don't we call on you to answer the question?
All right. Let's see. Jim, and then Bob, and then Don.
Yeah, well, thank you very much, Tannis, for bringing us up to date. I just had a couple of questions about your process, because having represented 350 in the legislature over the years, I know what a reach doing anything like this is. So Have you been in front of interim committees? Do you have co-sponsors? Where are we in that kind of process?
We did present at the interim committee on water and natural resources in this summer.
Clovis.
In Clovis, yeah, Tom was there. And we're talking to legislators about sponsoring, and we're also talking to lobbyists about assisting us. And that is about where we're at on that front. And we do recognize it's a heavy lift, which is why we're talking to lobbyists as well.
Thank you.
Bob, you want to go ahead and unmute
Sure.
yourself?
I wanted to mention two things that I didn't see in the slides, and that certainly could be subject to the fact that you want to get a bill passed rather than have everything in the world. But let me just name the two things that I thought were important and not missing, and were missing. And that is, first, that there's a need to have plenty of resources for close inspection and monitoring of operations and of abandoned wells. And right now, the OCD is terribly starved for resources for inspecting and monitoring. The other piece is that you should have credible penalties for violation, and a couple of $1,000 or even $100,000 penalties to this industry are trivial. You need something that will sting them, such as permit suspension or permit revocation. And so I think the two things, inspection and monitoring and the resources for it, and the other is to have penalties that mean something to this relatively affluent industry. And that's my pitch.
Yeah, no, could not agree with you more on both. Especially as an ex-state employee who did a lot of enforcement actions. I know all about that. So on the resources, the budget for the state agencies, that is not part of this bill and won't be. That is really part of MNERD's and the governor's budget request to the legislature. And over the last couple of years, groups like yours and ours have, and people like Dawn have pushed the legislature very hard for additional resources for enforcement, both for NMED and MNERD, and they have not been met with the kind of success that they should have. I think the agencies will continue to push for that, and I think that's the vehicle that we use for that. Funny, the second point, penalties, funny you mentioned that. That is actually something that we are probably going to add to our discussion draft, and that is this. Right now, the Oil and Gas Act sort of laughably limits civil penalties to $200,000 for a violation, for like a continuing violation. You don't see in other environmental enforcement statutes that kind of ceiling. Yet you see it for, as you point out, these relatively affluent oil and gas companies. So we believe that what we will also be asking for is elimination of that ceiling, which is completely out of whack with other environmental enforcement penalty schemes in the state. And also the 25, they have a pretty low daily minimum fine of $2,500, which again is out of whack with other environmental statutes that come in around $10,000 a day. So that is something that we want to put forward in our proposal on the one hand. On the other hand, you are right that this is not a kitchen sink proposal. We are trying to limit the proposal to things that, I mean, how realistic is it to get, this is a really heavy lift, but this is not a kitchen sink. There's lots and lots we could do to improve the landscape, so to speak. And so we are trying to limit what we're trying to do to something that's, within the realm of the possible, but the penalties is something that we want to include.
Yeah, well, thank you. I just wanted to plant the thought.
Don, you want to go ahead and unmute yourself?
It's tough to mute me, believe me. I don't want to speed bump over the fact what a fabulous job Tannis did bringing these rules home at OCD and at NMED. And I hope all of you have the chance to work with her like I did. What a great job. We really changed things in New Mexico. The second thing I want to do is tackle this new incredible opportunity with the revision of the Oil and Gas Act. And I want you to put me to work, Tannis, and let's get this sold, Tom Solomon. I don't know if this is going to work, but I just realized where I'm sitting on the wall in front of me is a picture that I'd like to show you all. So I don't know if it's going to work because it's a big picture, but I pulled it off the wall. Let's see if we can see it. You guys tell me.
Yeah, we can see it.
You can see it there. Okay. So right here is my uncle, Guy Shepherd. This is Governor Meacham. And Uncle Guy was land commissioner for 2 terms back in the 50s and early 60s. So when the Oil and Gas Act, Tannis, we're going to take this picture to the interim committee meetings, Jim, Tom, we're going to take this picture and say, this picture was taken when the Oil and Gas Act was written. This was what was going on in New Mexico at that time. And Uncle Guy was executing that to the best of his ability and doing what he should be doing as land commissioner. Uncle Guy's rules should not be the rules today. We have changed. And I'm sorry that he's not here. I know he would come forward with us, but we are living in a world that looks like that picture in the oil and gas regulation. Let's change that. We can do it.
It couldn't be more true. Sorely out of date.
So Tannis, what is it that, yeah, us common, ordinary citizens can do to, I know it's still in discussion drafts stage, but maybe just put our emails in the chat, and then we'll get notice of, when there's, contact your legislator.
Yeah, absolutely. When and if this comes before committees in this session, we'll have to have some kind of mass alert thing going on so we can work with you for that. But that is the thing. It will be contacting legislators, coming to those committee hearings, participating in those committee hearings.
Okay.
And just to kind of remind people, we've done this the last few years. 350 New Mexico has, and we will again have a list of the bills that we have prioritized as most important to pass in this coming session. And we'll update it with a bill status as each day ends and tell you where the next committee hearing is going to be held and how to engage and how to contact your legislators and all of that good stuff. So if people would like to participate with us again in that process, we will have lots of collateral on our website to help you engage and support the work that Tannis and Don and others are doing, and Kayley.
So we
Other
have
questions?
we have a note from Steve saying he's not in New Mexico, he's in DC. Is there anything we can have Steve do?
Well, Steve can, write to red legislators too.
Especially since,
Participate. Anybody can participate.
very good.
I think there is something, I think Kayley mentioned that we are waiting for the Biden administration to step forward with some strong new methane regulations. And this is a national issue. And so this is something that Steve, it's a local call. He can call over to the EPA or whoever he knows. Washington's not that big a town, and get the word out that the Environmental Protection Agency needs to get off their butt and get these regs in place that those of us who are living in the petro states in the United States sorely need.
I do see one question here from Charles about expanding who can be the petroleum engineer. Oh, yeah, in our proposal to geologist. The kind of technical expertise that is required in so many of OCD rulemakings really is of a petroleum engineer, I just have to say. One thing that we are proposing also in our legislation, which, I didn't get into, a few of the, less major proposals, is to expand the pool of people who can be OCD director, because right now the OCD director must be a petroleum engineer, and that is a small pool. And so we will be proposing that be expanded to somebody who has expertise in the operations of oil and gas, not necessarily a petroleum engineer.
Okay.
Very good. So if I'm missing any questions, someone please speak up, or and I just want to go back over.
There was one from one of Steffi Weisberg's clones that asked about the setbacks. Are the setbacks only for wells, or would they also include other processing facilities, including all of the other things that go into oil and gas? So Tannis, how about that, about setbacks?
That it depends on how it's defined, but right now, in terms of how it's defined, it would include other facilities that, an operation that emits pollutants would apply to.
For the setback. Very good. Thank you. Let's see if there are others.
Steffi, did you have another question?
No, that was actually my question. It wasn't the clone.
The real Steffi.
The real Steffi?
That was actually my question, Tom.
Okay, excellent.
Not one of my minions.
So I just want to summarize our thoughts about next steps that have been mentioned. First of all, Tannis told us about the EIB hearing, or the opportunity to make comment. And I think we have that information in the chat. Please advocate in this upcoming 2023 legislative session for increased funding for staff at the NMED and EMNRD, the Energy, Minerals, and Natural Resources Department. We probably need more staff at OCD, right?
Great. That's pictures there.
And then there are the long-awaited methane rules from the EPA, first promised in February of 2022. They're still not out. So in our follow-up talking points and action items that we'll send out to all the registrants, there's a request to contact legislators, the EPA and President Biden, and say, release those supplemental methane rules, because they're badly needed. And of course, we don't know if they'll be everything they need to be, or what's expected, but that's another thing to really keep an eye out for. So if people aren't on our 350 mailing list already, or where you get our email blasts, you might go to sign up. Do we do an info@newmexico.org, 350newmexico.org?
Yeah, I'll tell you what, I'll or you can just go to our website and sign up for our mailing list directly, and I'll just put that chat link into the chat.
And then the fourth thing, of course, will be to find out where the act, the New Mexico Oil and Gas Reform Act discussion draft ends up. And then once that's finalized, assuming it will be before the legislative session, to advocate with legislators and committee members for that act. So those are the things that I have. I may have missed something.
I'd just like to add one thing here. You know, there's a well-rehearsed cha-cha that goes on at the Roundhouse, and I'm sure Tannis and Tom and Don and others are aware of it. So we pass new regulations, you know, against all odds. And then the legislature refuses very consciously and purposefully to finance the enforcement mechanism. So we get all excited. We've got wonderful new methane regs in the state, which Tannis did a huge amount of work on, and Don and others. But we still don't have the enforcement infrastructure we need. And this, so we need to call out the legislature about this this little dance and stop being kind of suckered in by getting excited about when they pass something new and exciting for us without any enforcement mechanisms. It's tiresome, to put it mildly.
Yeah, just to add some meat to that, I believe, correct me if I'm wrong, Kayley or Tannis, but OCD has something like a dozen field enforcers for in excess of 50,000 wells in the state.
I think it might be less than that. I don't know the
You mean
exact.
fewer enforcers?
Yes,
Yeah.
I could be wrong.
Yeah, Don would know. Don, how many are there? They're all your
I think
friends.
it's like 8, you know.
Down to 8 now? Okay.
I think so.
Yeah.
And last I tuned in, it was like 100,000 wells.
It's about 80, I think. 80, 60,
54,000 wells active.
60.
Maybe that counts the inactive ones.
So 60, yeah, maybe 60.
It is
I should know
not
that
even
number.
close to being resourced. And like Kayley said, you would need an army of inspectors to do anything like an adequate job of overseeing this industry in the state. And it's just, it is a joke, the level to which the state and the legislature funds the enforcement capability of the state. So yes, lots of truth could be spoken to power on that subject.
Absolutely. Let's take one last question. Alex, you want to unmute and ask your question?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yeah.
I'm sorry to hear about Kayley's mom and the other people getting sick. Is there good proof that there are more cancers and people getting sick in this region? Have there been studies on that? And does the oil and gas industry say, yeah, it's too bad that people get cancer everywhere? I'm just curious. I don't know anything about them.
There hasn't been really any epidemiological studies in this region. I mean, obviously there are studies done on the health impacts from the oil and gas industry, and the research is pretty robust at this point that there are health impacts. This particular region is kind of difficult for those kinds of things. First of all, you don't have communities really advocating for it, but we don't have much healthcare infrastructure, you know, at the end of the day. So these studies are not happening in this area. Also, in Southeast New Mexico, you have a lot of folks traveling to Texas for medical care. So really getting any of that data in a centralized place is really quite a feat, just because of how often people are traveling out of state and then also to northern New Mexico to get healthcare.